Hello and welcome to another episode of Age Educational Podcast. I'm Roy.
I'm Terry.
So, this podcast, we've just started it here recently, and what we're trying to do is bring you information on aging. We're bringing you information for the aging themselves, for their caregivers, for adult children, and for some of us that are in the aging process to try to help us age better. So today we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Judy Ford with us. She grew up in Sydney and studied science at the University of Sydney. She obtained her first class honors degree in biology and genetics in 1967 and a PhD in 1971. Her postdoctoral work in embryology, then 25 years in clinical cytogenetics, motivated her research into the mechanisms of aging and the prevention of age-related diseases. Because of the complexity of biology and medicine, people tend to become experts in one field. It's difficult to transcend fields and link and make sense out of cross-disciplinary knowledge. Judy's knowledge of genetics, cell biology, physiology, biochemistry, and public health have helped her to make sense on the disparate research in aging. Judy is now enjoying being semi-retired, and she is writing and speaking on the research topics that most inspire her. In her current books she has are Why We Age, and she has a workbook, Why We Age, the Why We Age workbook that goes with that. So Judy, thanks so much for joining us today. And I must say, your bio ranks as one of the top with the longest, hardest words in it so far.
Yeah, sorry about the words.
Yeah. And I even read through that a few times just to make sure I could say them. Oh, no. Well, thanks so much. So talk to us a little bit about, what inspired you to write the Why We Age, and can walk us through what that goes through, what that entails.
All right. So I was inspired to write Why We Age because I'd done a lot of research and I'd published quite a few papers over the years. But, in the last 10 years of my employment, I was working as a lecturer to PhD students, teaching them how to be better PhD students. And I wasn't getting very many opportunities to do research. And really these days, to get people to really notice your research work, you have to write a lot of papers that are really almost on the same thing. So when you look at the literature and you look at papers by person A who's done very well, you see that actually there's quite a lot of overlap between their papers. Now I wasn't in a position to do that, but I had figured out, I thought, with the help of other people's data and all sorts of things, a lot of the mechanisms of aging that really weren't translating into other people's knowledge. So I felt that in order to try and get my whole thinking together, I needed to write a book. And then I had to try and think, who is my audience? And that is a little bit of a problem, because I think my audience are, at least for the first part of the book, my audience is people who have some sort of science or health background, who knows some of the words and who appreciate the whole sort of genre. Although I have to say that in the past year with COVID, everyone seems to be hearing all these huge words that I wouldn't dare to give people, and I think there's probably at least a greater expectation that people will understand many of the words that I've been trying to sort of pussyfoot around and simplify. Anyway, I was also asked to give some talks here to a group called the University of the Third Age. And so those are, a lot of the people who attend those meetings are people who have had various sorts of science backgrounds. And so I felt that they were people who would be able to understand this. But So the first part of the book attempts to explain about cells and cell division and what actually happens in the aging process, and why indeed aging is inevitable. So we start as one cell, and then our cells are going to divide hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and at various stages in our body we'll have millions and millions and millions of cells, some of which are self-destructing every day. And so basically the end is inevitable, because we're going to run out of cells. So that cells have a limited capacity to divide, and that one day there just won't be any capacity left. And in an ideal situation where we're very, very healthy, we'll just be a smaller, probably smaller, less active version of ourselves, and then we'll die in our sleep, if we could avoid all those age-related diseases. But the aging process itself produces high levels of what we know is called inflammation, but this inflammation itself is the thing that really causes our downfall. And so my book is a lot about how to reduce inflammation. But so the first part of the book is the theory, and it's putting together my thoughts, my published work, and the published work of other people to create sort of a whole theory of aging. And then the rest of the book, I actually look at a website called, I've forgotten the name of the website again. Anyhow, it's this World Statistics, and it's data from 182 countries of the order of the countries in deaths. So which of the top, which country has the highest rate of deaths from cardiovascular disease, and then which country has the lowest rate. And so from looking at that information and then just going in personally and looking at the lifestyles of the people in those countries and comparing it with what's already been published in the scientific literature, I have tried to figure out what are the major, not probably the only, but the major causes and the major preventative things for each of these top killers, and make some suggestions of how, in addition to everything else I say, how you might make your life healthier and more, and you'll live longer in a better, healthier state.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's funny
anyway.
You bring up inflammation, because the more that we talk about the subject of aging, but also things that go wrong with this, with cancer and with other things, it all seems to lead back to inflammation is really a huge catalyst for most of the things that go wrong with us.
That's right. And inflammation is caused primarily, so there are some other factors, but the primary cause is our cells reaching what is called their telomere limit. Now, so we've heard about telomeres, we've heard about telomerase, and so we've heard about people getting Nobel Prizes for discovering telomerase. We've heard about some people spruiking telomerase as something you should take to extend your telomeres, which I think is a seriously bad idea. But so if we go back to basics, the ends of our chromosomes have got little knobs on them, and these little knobs are telomeres. And when I first started doing genetics, we'd only just heard about telomeres, and we thought that they were to stop chromosomes from ends from sticking to one another. Anyway, gradually over the years, it's turned out that the telomeres have an important role in the spatial elements of cells. Anyway, But they also have an important role in DNA replication. And so every time a cell divides, prior to that division, all the chromosomes have to replicate their DNA. And the telomere is an essential component of being able to replicate the DNA. But in replicating the DNA, because of the process isn't quite perfect, a little bit of the telomere gets chopped off. And so you can only have so many pieces of your telomeres chopped off in any cell before that cell becomes defunct and can't divide anymore. Okay. And so once the telomere is chopped off, that cell has two possible things that can happen to it. Can either undergo a process called apoptosis, where it self-destructs and all the sort of goodies, the elements are recycled, you know, like breaking down a food and recycling everything that was in it. But that's one of the processes. But the other process, which is probably the one that dominates, the cell becomes senescent. So it stays in the system, unable to divide, unable to take up the important sort of fatty acids. Well, it can uptake some elements of nutrition, but it can't convert what are known as the short chain fatty acids into the healthier long chain fatty acids. And then the cell becomes senescent. And in this senescent sort of state with its rigid membranes, it becomes highly inflammatory. And so then the body is then concerned with trying to deal with the inflammation that's created by having all these stagnant sort of elderly cells. And so I have to give one of my most important messages at this stage, and that is that it's really one of the most important components of cell membranes is the conversion through to oleic acid. So stearic acid to oleic acid. And oleic acid is the major component of olive oil. And so all of these things that recognize the Mediterranean diet as being important, there are various aspects of the Mediterranean diet that are important, but probably the key element is the high intake of olive oil. And if you have, so as you get older, you need to start swimming in olive oil. Okay. So I have at least two dessert spoons, usually more like 4 every day of just raw olive oil, which I just put on my vegetables at night. And I love it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was an elderly Japanese doctor who died a few years ago in his late 90s. But in his late 90s, he was running up, his full 10 flights of stairs every day. And he swore by his olive oil, which he used to sort of have a drink of every morning. So, there's at least a case of one where it worked. But yeah. But in theory, having a high intake of olive oil should be one of the first steps to reducing inflammation. So because it will reduce inflammation in the cell, it'll stop it early in the process. And then there are lots of other things that you then need to do to reduce inflammation, and that's a case of boosting up all your key defense enzymes that actually are your garbage removers, and so that's really, really important.
So on the I just want to touch on the olive oil for a non-cooking individual. The question for me is that does cooking with it break it down, or is that still a good form, or is it better to eat it like yourself, to pour it over vegetables or something?
Raw. Yeah, it's not actually a very good cooking oil anyhow, because it's because of the temperature at which it sort of heats. So
Okay.
it's something to put on your salads, but you can just put it on anything, you know. And
Okay.
so, and it really, you must make sure you've got the extra virgin, and that it hasn't been processed. It needs to be a, you know, a cold pressed oil, but a good, really good quality. And there apparently have been some, you know, scams going on in the world, as there are with everything that's good. And so, but apparently in America and in Australia, we have the best regulations on quality of olive oil. So we should be all right, but
Okay.
maybe there are other people listening elsewhere who need to be careful. And it's very sad because some of the Italian oils are not as good as they should be because of you know, some people wanting to make some money on the way, and yeah, as they do.
So now the other thing I think that we talked a little bit about a few weeks ago was, didn't some of your research lead through Ireland? Wasn't there a group that did some research that was very interesting?
Scotland.
Or Scotland, maybe?
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Scotland. Okay, so these are actually people who did the work. So what happened to me was I was working along, being a person who analyzed chromosomes and analyzed cell division and doing a lot of work in the reproductive area, really. So I was sort of my first work was really it was partly because of the work I was doing, but I was very motivated to understand what it was that seemed to suddenly happen when women were 40 that gave them a high risk of having a child with Down syndrome or lots of miscarriages, and then shortly after that, infertility. And so I was interested. I had a few years where I didn't do any research at all. And then I was given the opportunity to do some research 1 day a week, but I didn't have any laboratory to actually do any research. So the only thing open to me was to analyze other people's data. So I went through and researched the literature, what had been written, to see whether anybody had actually looked at key changes in physiology that were occurring in that age group, in women, but possibly in men as well. And so I came across, the only thing I could find was this brilliant and huge study that was done in Dundee in Scotland, where they had taken just a little sample of fat from adipose tissue in the upper arm of a very large number of people, and they'd collected a lot of data about those people. And so they had published various graphs, and when I looked at them, I could see that there were huge changes that were occurring in fat metabolism that were obviously starting around sort of age 40. Anyway, I wrote to these people and I was very lucky to get a response from a person called Dr. Roger Tavendale, who I have not had the pleasure of meeting in person. And he was kind enough to say he had done the laboratory work, and that when he was working in a different place at this stage in the same institution, I think. He said that when he got back, he would try and find the data and actually send it to me. So with his the head of department's approval, and with some removal of anything that I shouldn't have been aware of, I received data from all the women in the study, and then I was able to analyze it in a different way, and with the help of a statistician who knew what she was doing, and to discover that in fact what we were really looking at was changes in fat metabolism in each of the key, they're called omega groups of fatty acids. And you could see that what was happening was that there was a reduction in the conversion through in each of these fatty acid pathways that was starting at this time in middle age, that was associated with reproductive problems. So from that was where I sort of then was able to start looking at cells and being able to understand that this was really the key aspect underlying aging, and how one thing was leading to the other, that sort of these fatty acid changes would occur, that they were occurring within all the cells, and then these changes inevitably meant that the cells became inflammatory and underwent senescence. I should say that going back to the earliest stages when I was doing tissue culture in the early 1970s, was it you said? Yeah. So there was a guy called Hayflick, and there's still a guy called Hayflick, I think, and I met him just a few years ago at a conference. But he realized that if you took the cells of a young person and you put them in culture, they could live in culture for a certain number of generations. And then if you took the cells of a child, a baby, a child, and then an adult, that in culture these cells would last less time the older the donor was. So the ones of the baby would last longest, and by the time you took cells from sort of even a teenager, they weren't lasting a long time in culture. And he called this phenomenon then the Hayflick limit. But I was able to use this sort of knowledge from back then to realize that it was when cells were reaching this Hayflick limit that they were becoming senescent. And then I was able to tie it in with the knowledge then that was around about telomeres and telomere structure, and sort of make sense of it all. So in one way, I think Why We Age has got this theory together in a comprehensive way that I think is sort of able to be understood by most sort of people who are interested. I know that some of my good friends who have come up totally through the arts faculties were not interested in reading this section of the book. They liked the other sections of the book, but they found this a bit heavy going. But anyone who has a little bit of a sciencey sort of bent finds this first part very interesting. But some people have said, it's not easy going. You do have to read it with care, and that's and so then yes. So because of all of this, I really want to change people's lives, and so that's why I then recently decided to create the workbook, so that I could take the messages out of each of the chapters that I didn't think many people were actually taking home and then put them in the workbook, so it was possible to really understand what I was getting at. So I didn't want you just to understand the theory. I wanted you to understand how the theory could hopefully impact on you and improve your life.
And actions that you can take, right? I mean, because it's never too late to start working on trying to, with the olive oil and all of that stuff, right?
No, well, I think the later you get, the harder it is to make a big impact. So obviously, if you're able to start earlier, so if I could get people. But the trouble is, people don't think about aging until they start aging. So they're not interested
until they start aging.
Right.
Yeah, young
Right.
people think they're immortal. Despite all evidence to the contrary, they think they're going to live forever. And it's really only when people start noticing. So I'm sort of thinking, well, probably not many people under 40 are going to take much notice of this book, but I would love the 40-year-olds to really take it seriously, because I think they could seriously change their lives. But really, you really need to start right from the word go. However, yes, yeah, I think even at my old age, oh well, I think there are many of the messages that are really important at every age. So, but probably you could have more impact if you took some of them earlier. You might be able to stop the arthritis and things if you started a bit earlier.
Yeah, so our message will be that contrary to your belief, you are going to grow old. So you might as well go ahead and plan for it early.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So
yes.
You did find some interesting information about one of my favorite things to have on Saturday morning. Didn't maple syrup, am I correct in that it played into your research somehow?
Yeah, I thought maple syrup was important. So, okay, so in the second part of the book, and I'm using these world statistics, I looked at who in the world had the highest rates of various diseases. So in the case of stroke, the highest rates are in countries that have very, very high rates of infection, right? So Indonesia, Sierra Leone, where they're countries where there's lots of flooding and there's lots of insect vectors and lots of infectious diseases, and we all know that when you travel to those countries, you're likely to get sick, right? So they're very high rates of infection. Now, people haven't necessarily associated stroke with infection, but it's definitely a factor. There are probably other factors, but infection is probably one of them, or is almost certainly one of them. Anyway, so what was the country in the world that had the lowest rate of stroke? And even it's reasonably high, but the lowest rate of stroke is in Canada, right? So in my thinking about countries, so how does Canada stand out from everybody else? There's a lot it has in common with Australia, who still have very high rate of stroke. But the one factor that to me stood out was maple syrup. So I thought, okay, so maple syrup. Now, maple syrup has a reasonable amount of sugar in it, so we don't want to eat too much maple syrup. But what does maple syrup have in it that's really good for you? And it turns out that it has two things. One is manganese, and the other is one of the B group vitamins. And both of these are involved in some of the, what shall we call them, the scavenger systems that are getting rid of the inflammation. So I haven't really gone into what these systems are, but there are 3 enzymes which are called superoxide dismutase enzymes. And these superoxide dismutase enzymes rely on you having the right amount of some micro components of your diet. And manganese is one of these. And so the superoxide dismutase that is most involved in strokes relies on manganese, and manganese is available in just about the right concentrations in a dessert spoon of maple syrup. All right.
Oh, nice. So waffles
Okay,
it is. Waffles,
yeah.
waffles it is
But
tomorrow.
I'm not talking about a pint of maple syrup. I'm talking about, just a spoonful or so. But I must admit, I believe my own rhetoric. So I've been having my maple syrup for ever since I wrote the book. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think you did say you have to be careful. It has to be true, authentic maple syrup, not
Absolutely.
a factory recreation, in order to have the right ingredients.
And look, these elements that we need, the other two are copper and zinc, and magnesium as well, and manganese. We need for the function of these dismutase enzymes. You know, they're trace elements. So they're the things that are called trace elements. And one of the problems these days is that with the reuse of soil and the overgrowth with agriculture, we're probably deficient in a lot of these trace elements, and yet and that's why we're getting so much increase in. It's one of the reasons why we're getting so much increase in a lot of diseases. But they are trace elements, so we don't want to take too much of them. So it's just sort of getting it right. And that's why I think it's better if you can eat foods that have, you know, enough of them in without sort of taking them as extras. So it's a tricky one. And the other, my major sort of detoxifier is a chemical called glutathione, which is our glutathione system. So we have these these other systems that work mostly through the mitochondria, and which are our energy systems, and they're sort of very much our earlier cleanup. And then our real sort of total garbage collector cleaner is glutathione, and that requires a lot of sulfur. And so if we don't have enough sulfur in our diet, then the sulfur is taken out of our cartilage, and that causes us to have osteoarthritis.
No.
So,
Okay.
yeah. And so when we look at studies that are done on old horses, for instance, you know, old horses, like old people, get osteoarthritis. And so they've been able to show that the amount of sulfur in the cartilage is reduced by a good 30% or more with aging.
Yeah.
So we need to have an intake of foods that have high amounts of sulfur. And unfortunately, the foods that we used to eat, a lot of offal, so eggs. So some of the foods that have a lot of sulfur in them are eggs, offal, almost all offal. But fortunately for me, seafood, not fish so much, some fish, but prawns, mollusks, lobsters, shrimp, all those sorts of things. And I like, we call them prawns, I think you call them shrimp. I like to have them. I buy a small amount. I have them on Fridays and Saturdays. That's my prawn days of the week. But I also take a supplement of sulfur called MSM. And don't ask me what that stands for, because I always get it a bit wrong. But that's a form of organic sulfur. And you'll know that a lot of people have promoted taking glucosamine and chondroitin. Now, they are also promoted because they are components of cartilage that have sulfur in them. But they are very large molecules, and they are reasonably poorly absorbed by the body. So the body absorbs organic sulfur better. So MSM is a better source of sulfur. It's also good, you know, to get it from food, but I don't think you get enough from food, mostly to support these, you know, aging, heavy legs.
One thing too that you know, we use ourselves is there are a lot of apps or computer programs that will look at a lot of these micronutrients like you're talking about. So you know, my advice is always to you know, just enter your food into these for a few days.
That's a good idea.
It'll give you a really good view. And like we've done, you know, we see where we are short on some micronutrients that we need to, beef up. And usually it turns out it's, in the greens, the spinaches, the kales, things like that,
Yeah.
that have a lot of these good nutrients. So anyway, I just always recommend that way you know what your intake is, and it's always better to intake through the foods. Yeah, and then you can always go to your doctor and show them what your nutrient levels are based on your diet, and then, they can help you adjust that if necessary.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether doctors are all, I mean, depending on who you go to. If you go to somebody who's a really specialist nutritionist, they're probably quite good. But I think that a lot of our everyday doctors probably don't know very much about nutrition. I know when I mean, and this is probably an awful thing to say, but when I worked at the hospital at which I worked, not naming, and I worked there for 20 years, and when you went at lunchtime and you looked at who was buying what, it was really quite funny, because the people who bought the worst food were the doctors.
Doctors.
And then they were buying all the fatty sort of pies and things. And the people who were buying the best food were the scientists, right? So, and then the nurses were pretty awful too. And in the days of smoking, the smoking by nurses and doctors was just amazing. So I haven't got a really excellent view of at least the past nutrition and behavior of doctors. They might be all reformed now, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it's always good too. You can reach out to a registered dietitian. I think they have a lot.
I think
the educational background for that as well.
Yeah.
So,
they're very motivated about food, and also they're motivated about helping you get that balance that will work for you. So I think the dietitian's probably the better option. Yeah.
So I do have a question that what you talked about earlier, the on the infection leading to stroke. I just wonder, was that like an immediate reaction, like I get the infection and then I have a stroke, or is this that people that may have got some infection 10 or 15 years ago that makes them more susceptible to stroke as they get older? Was there any delineation in that in the research?
Look, there's an awful lot of research on stroke, and I'm no expert. One thing I can tell you is that there is a strong association with dental health and strokes and susceptibility to stroke.
Yes.
And so if you've got poor dental health, you've got ragingly high numbers of microorganisms in your mouth. And of course, if you have poor gum health, those organisms get into your bloodstream. So, so we're not necessarily talking about having something that's, a one diagnosable infection, but we might be talking about having a very high load of a variety of bacteria in your system.
Okay. Yeah, and that's one where in the States that we are very deficient with the older population is delivering, the proper amount of dental care. And like you said, it's a place that, if I remember my science correctly, I think that heart disease can even start in your mouth as well.
Absolutely, and it can definitely, because there are definitely some forms of cardiovascular disease that are caused by infection. Look, it's I think in Australia, we've had a government funded medical system for a very long time. And that's great in that you can go to the doctor, but it is not funding dental care. And there's a little bit of dental care funded now, and there have been some childhood dental programs from time to time. But we should be funding dental care, because in many ways it's more important than funding medical care. You know, it's the
Correct.
first
Correct.
level. Yeah.
All right, Dr. Judy. Well, we're going to wrap up. We do appreciate your time very much. And so tell people how they can reach out to either yourself or if they want to pick up a copy of the Why We Age or the Why We Age workbook, how could they do that?
Right. Well, one way to reach out to me is to come to my website, which is drjudyford.com now. So that's sort of easy to find. They can buy the book, Why We Age, on either Amazon or on Google Books or from me. They can have a signed copy, but I don't have an automated sort of purchasing system. They can also buy the workbook from me, and I'd love to, but I have to post it to them. So I have to do it manually and have to work out how much it would cost. But I would love to hear from people, love for them to buy my book, but certainly Why We Age, easily available on Amazon or Google Books. And I'll probably put the workbook up on those sites too, but I haven't yet. So the workbook has only just been completed. I had some friends help me with editing it, and so it's really only in its final version in the last couple of days. But I will probably put that also on Amazon, and then that's probably the easiest way for a lot of people to get it, I think.
The workbook, I must say, was, you sent it to me, and I was very appreciative of that, because my pea brain, my head is spinning with all this scientific stuff, but I'm following you. I'm just being quiet because I'm in the process.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed the workbook. It was easy to understand for my lay pea brain.
Yeah, no, don't put yourself down, because this is very and there's a lot of heavy well, not a lot of heavy science, but it covers a lot of territory. There's a lot of information in it, and that's why I decided, look, I could easily pick out the key points and put them in the workbook. And I was really pleased with the workbook when I'd finished it. I thought, this is much more accessible. And not only is it more likely that people will actually get the take-home messages and do something about it, but I think it's got almost all the elements in it that you need to understand. So I think that the Why We Age, the full book is great if you really want to understand the whole concept of aging that I'm thinking about. But if you really just want to get the take-home elements, then the workbook is good.
Okay. All right. And what is your, can you tell us your website again, and we'll be sure and put it in.
Yes, so yes, thank you. So it's just all one word, drjudyford.com.
Okay. And it's DR, or is it Dr.
Yeah,
spelled out?
DR, just drjudyford.com. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Judy, thanks so much again. Great information. Y'all reach out and get Why We Age or the Why We Age workbook when it gets available. It's good stuff to learn. Just little simple things like the olive oil, and it also, if you read the background, it also helps us understand, why things happen to us, and then we can take better care of ourselves, hopefully, is the message there. So
spread the word.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for another episode of Educational. We do appreciate it. Again, we are on all the major podcast platforms. You can check us out on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon, all the major ones. If we're not on one that you use, please reach out. We'd love to add you. Also, we're always looking for interesting guests, professionals in the field, such as Dr. Judy. If you are a senior that has a story about your aging process, if you're a caregiver or an adult child, we would love to hear from you and see about hearing your story. So reach out to one of us, Roy at ageeducational.com, or Terry with a Y at ageeducational.com. We'd be glad to talk to you. So
Dr.
Also,
Judy, thank you so much.
Yeah. also
you.
again, we
Lovely.
are on, we are at www.educational.com, all the major social media platforms, as well as this will go, when the episode goes live, we will have this on YouTube as well. So again, thanks, ladies. Certainly do appreciate it. Appreciate your time, Dr. Judy, and hopefully we'll talk again very soon.
Thanks, Roy. Thanks, Terry.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
All righty.